At the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas on the evening of November 14, 1995, a space had been cleared in a private VIP room on the 32nd floor. 63 people occupied the space that night: journalists, trainers, fighters, and producers. The light fell across the carpet in pale rectangles from the strip below. The specific silence before a conversation turns into something it cannot take back. Royce Gracie was 29 years old that evening, 6 feet tall, 187 pounds, with the posture of a man who believed he had unlocked the future of combat itself. The Gracie family had spent 2 decades proving that ground fighting, submission grappling, positional dominance, the art of taking a man down and controlling him on his back, rendered all other martial arts secondary, almost obsolete. Royce had demonstrated this principle repeatedly on the largest platforms available. He had moved through the UFC with a kind of methodical inevitability. He had beaten Ken Shamrock. He had defeated a sumo wrestler named Taylor Tooley in 93 seconds. He carried with him the unspoken conviction that the old ways, the stand-up striking methods that had dominated martial arts cinema for 30 years, belonged now to a previous era. Chuck Norris was present that night, though few in the room had expected him to be. He stood near the windows overlooking the boulevard, in no particular hurry. He wore a white t-shirt that had been laundered many times and still maintained its cut, and a denim jacket the color of worn ocean water. His cap sat low. His shoes were street shoes, broken in, unobtrusive. At 55 years old, he was smaller than the younger man by 1 inch and 40 pounds. He had not fought competitively in years. He had not trained in weeks. The world had largely moved on from his era entirely. Nobody in that room knew they were about to witness the specific kind of silence that follows when a principle believed true for a decade collapses in a moment. In the next 11 seconds, Royce Gracie would experience something that could not be taught in a gymnasium, and the sentence Chuck Norris would speak afterward, spoken quietly, for only one man to hear, would remain in that younger man's mind for the rest of his life. Stay with us. The ground fighting revolution had momentum in 1995. It had been 5 years since the first UFC event, barely sanctioned, barely legal, broadcast on closed-circuit television to small crowds in Denver and Charlotte and other cities willing to risk the association with what looked very much like 2 men trying to kill each other on a canvas for money. The Gracie family had built their reputation on a simple truth stated over and over, with evidence stacked behind it like coins: the man who controls the ground controls the fight. A man on his back, positioned correctly, with leverage and knowledge, could submit an opponent twice his size. Years of training in this principle had made it functionally true. The world of martial arts cinema, the kicking champions, the bare-knuckle masters, the tournament fighters photographed in mid-air, looked increasingly like aesthetics applied to a system that no longer worked. Royce Gracie carried this knowledge in his posture. He had refined it, tested it, proven it. He spoke about it with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been contradicted by physical fact. The older martial artists dismissed him sometimes, but their dismissals came from a place of principle rather than evidence. They had not stepped into the cage. They had not tested themselves against the submission game. What they had instead was 30 years of tradition, and tradition, by 1995, looked very much like a thing collapsing. The evening at the Mirage had been arranged as something between a casual dinner and a philosophical debate. Journalists had been invited. A camera crew was running tape. Someone had thought it would make good television to have the 2 eras meet at a table with drinks and words. The old master and the new revolutionary. The striker and the grappler. The question had been framed weeks before the event: would the classic martial arts still hold up against modern submission techniques? Royce had smiled when the question was posed to him. He had trained his entire childhood in the family gym. He had rolled against his brothers, against visiting fighters, against anyone who would step on the mat. The principle had never once failed him in practice. He had no theoretical objection to standing with Chuck Norris. He had no fear of the outcome. He had instead a kind of pity, the way one might pity a man still arguing the merits of a horse when automobiles had already arrived. At the dinner, The conversation had been cordial, but cordial conversations between men representing different eras have a way of shifting. Someone asks the question that cannot be asked any other way. Someone says the thing that pivots everything forward. Around the table, the specific tension of men who recognized they were approaching something actual, something that would be remembered. Royce had been speaking about footwork, about the weakness of traditional martial arts when a man closes the distance and drops the level to initiate a takedown. He had been explaining, methodically, why all the striking techniques in the world became irrelevant the moment he decided to grapple. He was not angry about it, he was simply stating a fact, the way one states that water is wet. And then, in response to a question from one of the journalists, he had looked at Chuck Norris directly and said the thing that would echo. "Ground fighting ends you," Royce had said, with no malice in the phrasing. "Complete respect for what you've done. But that system ends once the fight reaches the ground, and I can put you there in under 10 seconds. The room had heard it. Chuck Norris had heard it. The statement had hung in the air with a specific weight, because it was not an insult issued in anger. It was a technical assessment, rendered kindly, and therefore all the more devastating. It was a public statement that the man sitting across the table from Chuck Norris believed him to be fundamentally outmatched by a single principle. Chuck Norris did not respond immediately. This was his custom. He did not defend his system against criticism. He did not need to. He stood, without hurry, and set down his drink with the deliberateness of a man who is no longer drinking. He reached back and removed his denim jacket with a single motion and folded it once lengthwise, and set it on the chair behind him. He did not look at the jacket as he folded it. The gesture contained no drama, because drama would have been decoration, and decoration would have been false. He looked up from the table at Royce Gracie. Around the room the moment passed through the journalists and trainers like a current. The people who had been in conversation stopped mid-sentence. The people who had been focused on their meals turned their attention forward. Even the camera operator tightened the frame, though no one had instructed him to do so. The specific recognition passed row by row through the assembled witnesses, the way a pattern moves across water when something breaks the surface. "Let us find out," Chuck said. The room had already begun to clear a space. 63 people do not need much room, but they instinctively create it when the structure of the evening shifts from conversation to something else. The carpet was dense, industrial, designed to accommodate the weight of chairs and tables and the comfortable movements of people pretending that nothing consequential was happening around them. It would serve as a floor tonight instead. Royce Gracie stood as well. He was the stronger man. He was the better trained man in the specific discipline of taking someone down. He understood leverage and positioning in a way that his opponent, for all his legend, had not practiced in decades. The confidence he carried was not unfounded. It was built on tested principle and 10,000 hours of practical experience. He moved forward with the posture of a man who has no reason to doubt the structure he has built his understanding upon. The distance between them was 8 feet. This distance contained specific information. It was the distance from which a takedown attempt could be initiated, from which commitment could not be reversed, from which the fighter attempting to close it gave up the advantage of positioning and gave it instead to the man who held the center line. A fight is not two men hitting each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance. The distance determines which tools are available. At 8 feet, a takedown attempt is possible but costly. It requires closing with a lowered head, exposing the back of the neck, committing the full weight of the body to a motion that has no abort point. At 8 feet, striking is still viable. At 4 feet, everything changes. At 2 feet, the grappler begins to own the space. At ground level, the standing fighter becomes theoretical. But the distance between 8 feet and ground level is where the negotiation occurs. And the negotiation is won by the man who understands that distance is language, and language is tactics. Royce closed the distance in what he believed was a controlled motion. He lowered his center, brought his arms forward, and initiated what wrestlers call a level change, the foundational movement of all takedown attempts. His weight committed, his momentum committed. The specific logic of grappling demanded that he continue forward now, that he complete the takedown with his hips, that he press through and drive his opponent backward and down. Second one. He did not complete the takedown. As his head lowered, as his center descended below the waist of his standing opponent, Chuck Norris had moved in a way that seemed almost passive. He did not block the takedown, he did not parry it, he had simply shifted the angle of his body by 3 degrees, and redirected the incoming weight into a vector that existed perpendicular to where Royce had intended to apply it. A tournament director watching from near the windows set his drink down on the console beside him with deliberate slowness, his hand still holding the glass. Because the motion required his hand's steadiness, because if he moved too quickly, if he turned too suddenly, he might miss what he was about to see. The momentum that had been intended to take Chuck Norris down and to the mat beneath him had instead carried Royce forward and past, and the younger man had to post his hands on the carpet to avoid falling. He pulled himself back up, breathing harder, reassessing the principle had not failed him. He had simply not executed at maximum commitment. He had tested the waters. Now he would commit fully. Second 2. He came forward again. This time, the takedown attempt carried more velocity. He did not lower his head as far. He had learned that his opponent had moved in response to the first attempt, and so he anticipated the movement and tried to move through it. His grip found fabric, he had caught the t-shirt, and he was pulling down with both hands, trying to drag his opponent's upper body forward and down. The specific logic was sound. Pull the man off balance, drop underneath him, drive through with the hips. It was the same principle that had worked thousands of times in thousands of gyms across the country. It was the principle that had ended dozens of fights in the UFC, but Chuck Norris had not moved backward. He had not moved at all. Instead, he had let his body weight shift into the incoming push, and as Royce pulled, as Royce committed his grip and his center to the action of dragging the older man down, Chuck Norris had posted one foot and stood upright. The mathematics of leverage did not favor what he had just done. The physics of the moment suggested that the man pulling downward with both hands, with body weight behind the motion, should have succeeded. He did not succeed. Instead, he had pulled himself into a position where he was exposed, where he was committed, where his own grip had become a liability because Chuck Norris was now holding both of Royce's wrists in his own hands, not through any pulling or force, but simply through the fact that Royce had offered them. A stunt coordinator who had been invited to the event because of his professional understanding of choreographed combat froze in place, his body still leaning forward from the last conversation he had been having, his mouth still open around words he had been in the middle of speaking. The sensation of witnessing someone understand something true in the moment that they are understanding it is specific. It does not happen often. It is usually not this clear. Second 3. Chuck Norris had asked a question with his body. The question was simple. It was, how would you like this to end? Royce Gracie had 3 options. He could abandon his grip and attempt to escape the position he was in, which would require him to roll backward and create distance, losing face and momentum. He could attempt the technique one more time, committing everything, accepting the risk. Or he could stop and ask the older man why none of his principle was working in this moment. He chose to attempt it again. This was the choice that would matter. This was the instant that would echo in his memory for decades, because it was the moment when he could have stopped, and because he did not. His legs drove forward, his hips rotated, every remaining shred of momentum he possessed was directed into a final attempt to take Chuck Norris down to the mat. And Chuck Norris held his wrists, and did not resist and did not yield, but instead lowered himself gradually, almost gently toward the ground, maintaining connection, maintaining control of the younger man's arms the entire time. So that when they both arrived at the ground, Royce discovered that he had not taken his opponent down. He had simply been permitted to arrive there at the end of a tether he did not know he was holding. Second 4, second 5, second 6. The specific arithmetic of what was happening had become apparent even to the people in the room who had no training, no context, no intellectual framework for understanding submission grappling. The older man was controlling the younger man. Not through strength, though strength was present, not through technique, though technique was clearly evident, but through an understanding of distance and leverage that the younger man had simply not anticipated. His entire principle, take it to the ground, where I can control you, had been inverted. He had been taken to the ground. He was on his back now. His wrists were still held by the older man's hands, and Chuck Norris was positioned over him, not pressing, not crushing, simply being present with such absolute dominance that every option Royce considered and discarded before he could act on it. Second 7. Royce attempted to move his legs, to establish a guard position, to use the fundamental principle of bottom position. That a man on his back with his legs available could still threaten his opponent and maintain hope. But his legs were not available, because Chuck Norris was controlling them as well. It had happened without violence, without impact. It had happened through understanding. Second 8. Royce understood that he could not move. Not because he was unable, but because moving would require him to accept damage, and accepting damage would require him to stay in the position, and staying in the position would mean that Chuck Norris would simply hold him here, absolutely helpless, for the remainder of time. Second 9. Second 10. A journalist who had written extensively about the UFC had stopped taking notes. The journalist had forgotten he was holding the pen. The moment had separated from the context of a news event, and had become something else. It had become a specific moment between two men that she was witnessing, and it was being witnessed by all 63 people in the room, and in the moment of witnessing, it would be transformed. It would become a story. And when stories are told over decades, they become something other than what happened. But what actually happened was this: a principle had been contradicted, a belief had been tested, and the belief had not survived the testing. Second 11. Chuck Norris released his grip on Royce's wrists and on his body and sat back, and then stood slowly, extending a hand downward to the younger man on the carpet. The motion had no aggression in it. There was no triumph in his posture. There was no anger. There was instead a kind of professional respect, rendered through action, that the second part of a conversation was about to begin. Royce took the offered hand and was pulled to his feet. He was breathing hard. His t-shirt was damp. His mind was moving through the specific texture of what had just happened to him, understanding in layers, understanding that what he had been certain about had been tested and had failed. The room was silent in the way that rooms become silent when the social agreement to ignore something has suddenly been removed. Chuck Norris spoke to him quietly, for only Royce to hear. And the words he spoke would be debated by the people in the room for years afterward. Some would swear he said one thing. Some would insist he said another. The journalists would write versions based on what they believed had been said. The truth was simpler. He had spoken a single sentence, and in that sentence he had given Royce Gracie a choice. The choice was this: would the younger man defend his principle, or would he accept that he had been offered an education? Would he become someone who had been humbled and had learned something, or would he become someone who had been humbled and had learned nothing? Royce stood there, breathing, considering. The people in the room waited to see what he would choose. And then, after a moment that felt longer than 11 seconds, after a moment that felt like it contained an entire history of what could have been said and done, Royce Gracie nodded once. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Chuck Norris. He simply nodded, acknowledging in that gesture that he had been wrong about something essential. That ground fighting did not end Chuck Norris. That there was still something true in the older methods that he had underestimated. As Chuck Norris turned to return to the table, a stunt coordinator stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. The specific gesture of contact that witnesses use to confirm that something they have seen is real, that it is not a story they have constructed in the aftermath, but something solid. Something that occurred in the world and can be verified through touch. Others did the same. By the time Chuck Norris had collected his folded jacket and was preparing to leave the room, 4 people had touched him in this way. The signal had been passed through the group: what you have witnessed is true. This happened. The story spread differently than other stories spread. The UFC was growing, but it was not mainstream yet. The journalists would publish their accounts in fighting magazines and trade journals. They would describe what they had seen in different ways, and each description would shade the original event, would add details that seemed to fit the narrative, would remove details that did not. Some versions had Chuck Norris breaking Royce's arm. Some versions had him placing Royce in a submission hold so severe that the younger man had tapped out before they hit the ground. Some versions had the two of them fighting for hours, with Chuck Norris emerging victorious only through sheer perseverance. The specific details had been lost, but the essence had been preserved. The old master had contradicted the new principal, and the new principal had not survived the contradiction. Within 6 months, the story had been amplified across dojo walls in 6 states. Within a year, it had reached Europe. Fighters who trained in submission grappling began to ask themselves whether the principle was truly as unassailable as they had believed. The UFC would continue to grow. Royce Gracie would remain relevant, would become wealthy, would be honored for his contributions to the sport. But something had shifted for him, had shifted for everyone who heard the story. The ground fighting revolution was not the endpoint. It was a chapter. Chuck Norris did not speak about the incident publicly. He did not grant interviews about it. He did not offer his version. He had learned long ago that a story belongs more to the people who tell it than to the man who lived it. He let the story become whatever the people who carried it needed it to become. He understood that in this way, the event would ripple further than if he had tried to control the narrative. By remaining silent, by offering nothing, he had given the story space to grow. Decades later, when Royce Gracie was older himself, when he had moved away from active fighting and toward the business of the family enterprise, he would sometimes be asked about what had happened that evening at the Mirage. And he would give different versions depending on who was asking and what he thought they needed to understand. But in private moments, he would remember the specific silence of that room, the specific sensation of being helpless in a way he had not believed was possible, the specific tone of voice in which Chuck Norris had spoken the sentence that only he had heard. And he would know that he had been given a gift wrapped in humiliation, and that the gift was the gift of knowing that he had been wrong about something essential. The principle held. The principle still holds. Ground fighting is a complete system. A man who controls the ground controls the fight. Royce Gracie had been correct about this, but Chuck Norris had demonstrated something that the young man had not yet learned, that a principle is always secondary to understanding. Understanding distance, understanding leverage, understanding the moment when to hold and when to release, understanding that a man can be proven wrong without being destroyed, that humiliation can be rendered with mercy, that the most powerful lesson is often delivered in the form of a question disguised as a hand extended downward from a standing position. In the present day, mixed martial arts has become one of the dominant fighting systems in the world. The Gracie family is synonymous with martial arts legitimacy. But the story of what happened at the Mirage in November of 1995 persists in gyms and in conversations between men who respect what both of these men represented. It persists because it speaks to something true, that mastery of a single system is not the same as mastery of principle itself. That respect can be more powerful than victory, that a man can lose a confrontation and win an education, and that this is in fact the higher victory. There is a specific kind of silence that follows when a man understands that he has been wrong about something essential. It is not the silence of defeat. It is the silence of recalibration. It is the silence of a man thinking through, for the first time, the difference between being right and being wise. The people in that room heard this silence. It is why the story has never died. It is why it is still being told. Some encounters are not meant to be won, they are meant to be survived. And some men are remembered, not for the battles they won, but for the men they taught, and the lessons they delivered through the specific language of humility rendered with respect and mercy offered to someone who had believed they did not need it. When a man truly understands that, when he lets that understanding move through him the way a current moves through water, he becomes something other than a fighter. He becomes a teacher. And his opponents, in the moment of their defeat, are finally able to hear his instruction. Next week we will examine the time Chuck Norris proved that a martial arts form dismissed as theatrical could neutralize the most dangerous striking technique in modern combat. It is a story that changed the way an entire generation thought about what is real. Do not miss it.